we have an opening presentation and a keynote presentation from Mr. Robin Mortimer, Chief Executive of the Port of London Authority. Now, Robin hasn't been in post, I know, that long. He joined the PLA on the 31st of March 2014. And London, of course, is one of the UK's major ports and has a very, very busy and diverse inland waterway. And the Thames actually contributes over £6 billion annually to the UK economy, so it's a pretty important gateway port. Prior to joining the PLA, Robin had 20 years' experience in the UK civil service, working on transport, environment, infrastructure and overseas development. He was the lead author of the UK Climate Change Act, which actually became law in 2007. And as a director in DEFRA, led the government's Adapting to Climate Change programme and oversaw the creation of the Canal and River Trust and directed policy on farming and the environment. Robin is also a member of the CBI's London Council and since 2012 is a trustee of the United Nations Environmental Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre, which is a Cambridge-based charity. So an eminently well-qualified keynote speaker to start us off this morning, Robin.
Thank you very much, and morning, everybody. It's great to be here. As the introduction said, I am currently head of the Port of London Authority, and I'll give you a little bit of detail on the Port of London in a moment. But what I'm primarily here to speak about, as the billing says, is the PLA, the Port of London Authority experience in dealing with climate change adaptation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover a little bit of the overall sort of UK framework for this, which I was involved and had the privilege of being part of when the Climate Change Act was passed, and then go on to talk about the PLA's experience in the implementation of that act. So in a sense, it's a little bit of policy through to implementation and delivery, and some of the lessons learned as we look forward. So first of all, just to give you a bit of background on the UK framework. So I first became involved in climate change policy actually back in 1997, around the time of the Kyoto Protocol, and when I was working for John Prescott, who was the UK's Deputy Prime Minister at that point. And subsequently, over the next 10 years, was involved in both climate mitigation and adaptation policy. And it's quite interesting sort of looking back and reflecting on how little discussion there was of adaptation. I think in the early noughties, it was still seen in climate policy circles as a statement of defeat. It was almost a dirty word in climate policy circles. We simply can't be talking about that. We have to tackle the causes. And I think it was only really through the first part of that decade that it became accepted that we need a twin-track approach, both to mitigate the impacts and to deal with to mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions and to deal with the effects of climate change. And that led to in the UK to what was at that stage a pretty pioneering piece of legislation, which was the Climate Change Bill, and then which became the Climate Change Act in 2008. And it was the first national legislation of its kind. There had been some precursor legislation of a similar sort in California and one or two US states. But in 2006, the UK government, really actually politically, in order to position itself as greener than the opposition at that point, decided to have a Climate Change Act and to set in statute carbon budgets to reduce the UK's climate emissions, which of course are now fairly common features of climate policy. And also, for the first time, to legislate on adaptation. And I think it's fair to say that when we decided as the central policy team to include adaptation, we had absolutely no idea what we were going to include in the Act. And it was a sort of a political judgment that something needed to be said about adaptation. And we were given a fairly blank piece of paper to work out what that should be. Now, the second thing, I'll come back to that in a second, the second thing that came together around that time was that the UK Met Office had been working for a number of years on improving the climate models for the UK. And in 2009, we published the UK climate projections, and they were produced in draft in 2008. So these two things that came together as the sort of fundamental building blocks of the national approach to adaptation. And the key messages from the UK climate projections, which are very familiar, I think, in terms of Northern European climate modelling. But when I came to write this presentation, it struck me how simple these phrases were, because I could remember them almost exactly from the press notices we wrote back in 2009, that the idea of hotter, drier summers, warmer, wetter winters, more storminess, more extreme weather events, sea level rise and so on, were very simple messages at that point to try and land with the public, and there was a lot of media interest around that time in climate policy to get across the fact that the UK climate was going to change. We could tell broadly what was going to happen, and then of course there were sort of quantified projections for policymakers and those with statutory responsibilities. But for a general UK public audience, these sort of simple messages were really important. And the last one on that list, which I'll come back to later, is of course uncertainty. And we were very clear in presenting the data and the Met Office data and the Climate Change Act for public audience that uncertainty was a feature of all of our evidence base. We simply cannot look forward 50 years and say for definite, how many centimetres sea level is going to rise by and so on. And it's surprisingly hard, I found, in dealing with sort of national media to talk about uncertainty. Because, of course, media always wants certainty. And does that mean you don't know what you're talking about? Well, no, we do know what we're talking about, but trying to discuss sort of stochastic projections is not particularly easy when you're dealing with tabloid journalists. So we were just generally trying to make the point of, look, we know broadly what's going to happen, but of course there's uncertainty around the extent, the degree, the pace, and so on. And dealing with that uncertainty in climate adaptation policy is incredibly important. Now, just a bit, before I then get into the PLA's experience as a port in dealing with adaptation and the implementation of that Act, let me just give you a sort of brief detour, if you like, into what we are, who we are, what we deal with. Some of you will know my colleague Don Cockrell is here, who's a pilot on the Thames, as well as representing the UK MPA. So the Port of London Authority is a statutory body. We're a trust port. We were set up in 1908 in legislation which its precursors date way back into the Middle Ages. We have a jurisdiction which is 95 miles from Teddington Lock in the west, which is where the tidal waters end, out to the line you see there in the North Sea. And our strategy is simple. It's to protect, which is protect people and the environment, to improve, that's improve the river and the organisation, and promote, to get across how important the Thames is in the life of the nation and the economy of London and the southeast of England. And just a couple of facts and figures in terms of where we are right now. So 2016, we had a huge increase in port trade, 11%, a strong showing. I think a number of us expected a sort of Brexit impact in the trade figures, which didn't happen. In fact, the second half of the year was incredibly strong. We wait to see what happens, obviously, in the next 2 years. 50 million tonnes was passed in 2016 for the first time since the recession. It makes us the second biggest port in the UK after the Humber ports, Grimsby and Immingham. Inland freight, we're by far the busiest inland freight waterway in the UK, typically handling around 3 million tonnes a year, waste, spoil, building products, obviously volume goods as you'd expect. And the third sort of key feature of the Thames is its importance for passenger transport, and this has grown exponentially. In 2000, there were 4 million passengers using the river annually. In 2016, we were up to 10.5 million. And obviously on top of that, there's all sorts of recreational activity as well. So it's an incredibly diverse and busy waterway, ranging from the biggest container ships in the world at London Gateway through to stand-up paddleboarders and small passenger boats in the west. Now, coming back to the central theme then, so the port, the PLA and its responsibilities. So the Climate Change Act, as I said earlier, we were... Going back to my DEFRA days for a moment, we were trying to come up with a framework which created a process. So it's quite an unusual thing to do in legislative terms. Rather than there being specific obligations, thou shalt not do this, that, or the other, what we were trying to create was an ongoing process for organisations to analyse and then to put in place plans to prepare for the impacts of climate change. So Section 61 of the Act says that the authorities, reporting authorities as they're called, which is essentially every organisation we could think of that has statutory responsibilities that might possibly be affected by climate change, every authority has to, first of all, assess the current and predicted impacts of climate change. Secondly, set out the organisation's policies and proposals for adaptation. And then thirdly, keep that under review. And then to enter into a cycle, a 5-yearly cycle, to update its and publish its plans. That was the requirements in the Act. And as I say, they applied to a huge range of organisations across the public sector, ranging from health service bodies to transport and infrastructure organisations, to police authorities and so on. So we were one of many, many organisations required to produce a plan. The first thing the PLA did, and this I have to say, the first version of the adaptation report predates my time in the PLA, so I'm now talking about a process I wasn't personally involved in, but have been in the update. The first thing the PLA did was to gather together the evidence base for the first of those statutory obligations. So what are the impacts on port activities? And what the PLA did was to work sort of national level down. So the first level is the UK climate projection, so the broad picture of warmer, wetter winters, hotter, drier summers, and so on. Secondly, then to take a set of regional models which were produced again by the Met Office for different parts of the UK, which provided more granular data on the southeast of England. Thirdly, there was also very specific work done by the UK's Environment Agency under a project called Thames Estuary 2100, which was looking at the impacts for London. Its focus primarily was on the future of the Thames Barrier to protect London, and when a new Thames Barrier or new or additions to the existing flood defences would be needed in the Thames. So that was a third, more local piece of information. And then beyond that, there was also sort of geographical dimensions, so the geographical and spatial. So the other reports used looked at the marine environment, which was data produced for the Met Office specifically for the North Sea. A report which looked directly at the impacts on recreation and navigation, and a very detailed piece of work on probabilistic wind speed, which is, I think, still the most complicated dimension of climate change to model with any certainty. The next step that the organisation had to do is to say, okay, all of this data is produced in probabilistic terms. Which one do we want to pick? What do we want to plan for? And I think this is a kind of key feature of any adaptation plan, is to decide, what your overall appetite for risk is. So if you are an organisation which is able to respond relatively quickly to more extreme events, then perhaps you only have to plan for a medium scenario. If on the other hand you are an organisation which is building extremely expensive long-term infrastructure, which you want to be there for 200 years, then clearly you need to plan for a higher level of risk. So the PLA decided to opt for the middle scenario. So medium emissions, obviously one of the factors which affects climate adaptation long term is how fast the world mitigates the current impacts. So we took a scenario which said that we were on a medium emissions trajectory. And then the 50% probability level of impact. So not the worst case, not the most optimistic, but the central case. Secondly, the organisation decided to take a middle view on the fluvial flows at Teddington Lock. In other words, the impact of rainfall, particularly in the winter months, on the flows of water over the lock, which separates the tidal waters from the non-tidal waters, where the greatest risk of flooding is. Again, we took a medium scenario on sea level rise, and also looked particularly at the issue of fog. And this is, of course, very important for marine operations, particularly pilotage, where the modelling is quite difficult to interpret. But the general view seems to be that there'll be an annual reduction. On average, fog will get less in London. Dickens would be pleased. But in the winter months, there'll be more fog, so much more concentrated, as you would expect with warmer and wetter winter months. But with hotter and drier summers, it counteracts the effects on an annual basis. The next step in the process, having identified and pulled together the evidence base, is really not, to use a horrible phrase, not rocket science. It's really to say, look, get the best people together that you have, the people who have most knowledge about the port, to sit down and say, well, how could this affect the operation? And I'm not sure there is a more scientific way to do it than that for most organisations. You know, the knowledge base is best in the Port Authority, and so there was a process which went on, a bunch of workshops to sit down and say, okay, so so what could happen? Let's kind of assess this risk ourselves. And work out where we expect, as an organisation, the greatest impacts to be. And this led to some surprising conclusions. I believe that when the team went into this process, their expectations were about the impacts in the estuary on the major port operations, the freight operations. And having thought about it, having looked at the evidence base as to where the impacts are likely to be, the conclusion was the opposite, that actually the heavy freight operation in the estuary are relatively well protected, high flood defences, and resilient infrastructure. The greatest impacts were in fact more likely to be in the upper reaches, particularly in relation to unmanned navigational craft. So the report which the PLA then produced had a number of measures in it then which start to respond to this. And it's always important to bear in mind, of course, that adaptation policies are over a decadal time span. So if you're thinking about a 50-year set of impacts, the number of things you might have to do in the very short term could be quite few, which doesn't, to my mind, negate the need for a plan, but it does mean that you shouldn't panic and overreact. So the sorts of things which the plan included were the obvious one of continually monitoring impacts and seeing what was actually happening in practice. A specific issue around tree and vegetation management. We own a lot of the towpath in the upper reaches and regularly manage the vegetation there so that rowers have access, and we usually end up with lots of upset residents who don't like trees being cut down, and in replacing the vegetation, we've gone for a climate resilient, a different species mix, so that those species are resilient to future climate change. We looked at our own infrastructure investments, looking at things like flood protection, and then importantly, also there's a kind of corporate side to this, which is making sure that climate change is part of our ongoing risk assessment process. And the net result of this was a report which we sent to DEFRA and got a very nice letter back, along with our sort of scorecard of how well the report did. And actually the PLA's was one of the best reports that was produced under the Climate Change Act powers, according to the department. And then, the final bit of the presentation is just to say sort of events, dear boy, events. What then happened was completely unexpected. So 2 years after the publication of the adaptation report, in 2011, that's the typical typical flow over Teddington Weir, excuse me, in the west of London. Mid-December in 2011, slightly higher. And then there was a period from January to March 2012, which is the bottom picture, when there was a totally unexpected huge increase in flooding in the west of London, leading to 10 times the expected and anticipated flow over Teddington Weir. And this led to closures of the river for navigation. All of the things which the PLA had put into place, which we were expecting to gradually have to introduce over the next 50 years, were all put in over that one winter. The Environment Agency said it was a 1 in 200 year event. And I think that, just to reinforce really the final slide, which is to say that you can never stop doing this stuff. The update report, which we've subsequently produced in December 2015, looked at the lessons, particularly this one from the winter of 2011-12, and built in a lot more thinking around how to deal with those 1 in 200 year extreme events, which may be 1 in 200, but it might be next year. And maybe we've got that wrong, and maybe 1 in 200 is too infrequent in any event. So the lessons learned from that really was to build in much more planning around worst case scenarios, and to recognise that there also needs to be contingency plans in place for responding to those events. The impacts on navigation were significant during that period. The Thames Barrier was closed around 40 times, which was every other day, which meant that obviously vessels couldn't transit up through the Thames Barrier, lots of river closures, a flag system to alert the rowers and kayakers to not use the river. So a complete disruption of the port. And to some extent, there was nothing much we could do about that once it was happening. All we can do is to have in place communication strategies and plans to be able to respond in the moment and to update our plans as those events occur. So that was really a quick run through my experience. The thing I would just leave you with, and this is a little bit of an advert actually, which has nothing to do with one thing to do with the PLA and one thing which isn't. In my time in DEFRA, I dealt with a number of climate skeptic ministers, and it's a sort of perennial problem as a civil servant that, of course, you have to deal with whoever comes along, and you'd have a minister who'd say, well, it's all natural cause, of course, nothing to do with greenhouse gas emissions. And the one website that I would always try and point people to is one called CO2.earth, which you may be familiar with, which gives you the daily readings of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And I always found it a very powerful tool to be able to say to people, well, look, it's 406.22 today, according to NASA, and it's 280 before the Industrial Revolution. What's going on? Is this possibly something to do with climate change? And so the real world or the daily impact of being able to see exactly what's happening to CO2, I always found quite a powerful communications tool if you are dealing with any climate skeptics in your organisations. And the second thing, just to say, is that we do have a new PLA app which has just launched, which, if you're interested in knowing more about the tidal Thames, you can now get it at a touch of a thumb. PLA Tidal Thames, and it gives you the tidal data. And the reason I mention it is because this is our first step into the app world. Gives us another way in which we can deal with climate change adaptation, because as we see changes in water quality or changes in tidal flow or the level of tides, this will be the means in which we in future communicate to users of the river what's happening. So that use of technology, I think, is an important part of a long-term adaptation strategy. Thank you very much.